This talk kind of had a long odyssey, just like the presidency itself. It really began back in December of '96. I have this terrible habit of having breakfast with the Sunday New York Times before I go out. And the cover story had a title saying, "The Ultimate Approval Rating" by Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., the most recently deceased historian. I think you've all known him, known his works and such. Anyway, Bill Clinton's second inauguration was a few weeks away. The media was filled with speculation about how the first baby boomer president might act in a second term. And the president himself was out opining all over the place about legacies. He was said to be obsessed with his legacy, Mr. Clinton. Apparently he'd read books about all of his predecessors, was trying to figure out, how do I make the short list of the greats without a war, and those kinds of things. Well, the newspaper asked Schlesinger to replicate a survey his father had done all the way back in 1948 and updated in 1962, where they asked a number of historians to place each of the nation's presidents. The incumbent at the time was Harry Truman. He was exempted from the poll. To evaluate all the presidents, put them in one of five categories: great, near great, average, below average, and failure. Now, prior to the elder Schlesinger's pioneering of this rating game business back in 1948, perhaps as early as with Henry Lee in his description of Washington as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, people began speaking of great presidents and failed presidents. With the advent of the Schlesinger-type survey, however, they no longer had to make a case as to what made a president good or bad. All they had to do was rely on the, quote, experts. Reporters and writers of textbooks are only too happy to oblige, rushing the results of the latest surveys into print, often competing surveys into print, without a line of interpretation. Slowly, the air of authoritativeness the surveys conveyed replaced critical reason and argument among most readers, save for those who happen to be specialists on one or more presidencies. What student, maybe other than mine, perhaps, would, in this age of authoritativeness, dare make a case for a weaker president being a stronger president when his professor, his textbooks, and everybody who in his field tells him, yeah, but the surveys put Mr. Truman in this kind of a box. Now, with the glaring exception of Dwight Eisenhower, whose ratings have risen significantly in the view of historians since 1962 and 1996, once a president falls into a category, he seems to stay there for eternity. Now, about Mr. Eisenhower, presidents matter, presidents make differences, and so occasionally political scientists. And, the best thing that ever happened to Ike since his two landslides was Fred Greenstein. When I was here, Fred was starting his book on Eisenhower, and I have to tell you, he was swimming up two streams, with the stream of political scientists who always jumped over Eisenhower, and the stream of historians who always thought it was too boring to cover. And then Fred actually went out to the library. He said, there was more there than meets the eye. So occasionally a political scientist can make a difference. But some of the others have not found a Fred, and they're still sort of, cast in stone. Now, one myth that has made it into contemporary lore in recent years is that historians over time have changed their view of Mr. Eisenhower's predecessor, Harry Truman. Not so. He was exempted from the 48 poll, as I just told you. By 1962, he was out of office a little more than a dozen years. By 1962, he was among the near greats, where he remains. What is true, though, is the public's rating of Mr. Truman has changed significantly. Now, when he was president, the last year of his presidency, Gallup put him in the lowest rank yet ever received by a president, 22%. Now, that is about 5 points less than Richard Nixon was the day he resigned. So I guess you could say to Mr. Bush, there is hope. There is hope. One can always go up again. Now, of course, Truman didn't find, maybe he didn't need a Fred. He didn't find a Fred, but there were two books that some of you may have known. One came out during Watergate, Plain Speaking, by a fellow named Merrill Miller, which was a series of purported oral histories he did with the former president. Then the other, of course, was David McCullough's magisterial biography, which some of you may have read. Now, along with several factors, including the well, I'm now opining, the dumping down of curricula, creeping political correctness, which often tends to slight white males. And I must say that all of our deceased presidents are dead white males. Okay, and many, many other things, teaching history from the bottom up, and things like this. Presidents have, I won't say fallen from the curriculum, but they've, let's say they've taken second place, except for the biggies, except for the usual honor roll that we have. But given that the presidency, the office, and the occupant still remains probably the most important individual in the world, I was hoping we could find a better way of doing this. The public, general public, still seems fascinated with the presidency. I can't think of any other office. You can go to Washington and get president's paper mats, president's fountain pens, presidential lunch boxes. You just don't see this with speakers of the House. Yes, don't. And I was saying, these poor commuters coming home from work, they are at least spared groping headlines that we see about the presidency all the time. Imagine this. Group of experts proclaim Henry Clay greatest speaker of the House. Rayburn rated near great. Debate ensues as to whether Gingrich among the best or the worst, right? We just don't see it. Now, I must say, though, journalists are picking up the Schlesinger game, to my great consternation. With this sinus problem, I was sitting in a doctor's office. And what do I see? Reader's Digest. Well, it's the only place you can find Reader's Digest these days, thank God. And there's an article there by Carl Cannon. Those of us know him better from the National Journal. And it's basically what kind of a president. They're doing a series on all the presidents. What kind of president would John McCain make? Well, he then goes out and he talks to, he has his own little panel here, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people, and 3 identifiable conservatives, 3 identifiable liberals, and 2 I couldn't quite figure out. And lo and behold, on a possible rating game, rating of 1 for the worst, 5 for the best, John McCain comes in at a 2.9. Now, I don't know what this is supposed to tell voters. I really don't. But I think Mr. McCain would be happy to know that both Robbie George and I did better in last semester teaching evaluations on the same kind of a scale. So here we are. Okay. So now, in addition to stifling the discussion, which I talked about earlier, and the tendency to direct attention primarily to presidents rated either as glowing successes or monumental failures, some of the surveys purport to be, quote, objective measurements have camouflaged, not always consciously, the public preferences and political biases of supposed neutral evaluators. Now, as Calvin Coolidge, I have a thing for him, as some of you will discover, as Calvin Coolidge, who most surveys place among the undistinguished, and who Schlesinger found wanting in, quote, lyrical outbursts. This is directly from Schlesinger. When he wants to quote Coolidge, he says, in a rare lyrical outburst. But as Coolidge put it in another speech, quote, unfortunately, not all experts are entirely disinterested. Not all specialists are without guile. Now, there's one great story about Coolidge. He chose not to run again in 1928. And a reporter was going into his office, and of course, I almost did what Harry von Zell did. I almost said Hubert Heaver, but Herbert Hoover was leaving Coolidge's office, and in comes the reporter. And he said, well, that was Mr. Hoover. And Coolidge says, yep. And he said, what do you think? He said, experts. What do you mean, Mr. President? For 7 years, I've been listening to that man's advice, all of it bad. All right? So I don't think Calvin would have liked these, quote, surveys about what the experts tell us. But here's where I think he may have been onto something. I looked at Schlesinger's rating. The briefest glimpse into where Ronald Reagan placed in Schlesinger's survey suggests that the panel Schlesinger convened was not perhaps as disinterested as claimed. Elsewhere, I wrote an article about this before, but of Schlesinger's 32, I'm trying to jump through this because I want to get to the questions. Of Schlesinger's 32 panelists, several he readily admitted were known to espouse what might be called liberal democratic positions. Some served as advisors to past Democratic presidents and candidates. Several had signed paid advertisements in which, citing their professional credentials as historians, They argue that it would be contrary to the intent of the framers to impeach Bill Clinton or remove him from office. Now, I always think it's interesting that when we're talking about the intent of the framers, we're not supposed to look at this regarding justice of the court. But we can do it when we're arguing about impeachment. What would Hamilton do? And that kind of thing. Well, anyway, no self or otherwise identifiable conservative appeared on Schlesinger's list, with the possible exception of Forrest McDonald. Now, I didn't quite know McDonald's ideology. I had an idea, but he then wrote a letter to the Times attacking the poll, pointing out that he was the only conservative given a ballot, so I found out that he was a conservative. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known it from his writings sometimes. Appearing on the list of, quote, experts on the presidency, Schlesinger polled were two former Democratic elected office holders. Former New York Governor Mario Cuomo, the real fair judge of Reagan, right? And former Illinois Senator Paul Simon. The presumed justification were both were amateur historians and Lincoln enthusiasts. Okay. Absent from the list were any of a number of Republican former officials, whether elected or appointed, with equal or superior academic credentials. Among the absentees I noted were William Bennett, Gene Kirkpatrick, Newt Gingrich, George Shultz, all holders of PhDs, and at least once in their career, full-time academics. Some even taught the presidency. I lament my failure to cite Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, who was also absent. Thankfully, I did include George Will, who has a PhD from this institution. Also conspicuously missing was on Schlesinger's list was erstwhile presidential advisor Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, in the words of George Will, had written more books than most of his colleagues ever read. So, I mean, this is objectivity for you. So, explaining the results of his poll, Schlesinger volunteered that jurors were left to decide for themselves how presidential performances were to be judged. Okay? In their finding, though, he sees a commonality among the 9 men who placed in the highest in the 1996 survey and the one his father conducted back in '62. These were Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Polk, Lincoln, Wilson, the 2 Roosevelts, and Truman. All of them, he assures readers, offering no apology to the first George Bush, who used to talk about the vision thing, okay, but is that all of these men articulated a sense of the ideal America and set their administration on a path toward achieving it. But to score highly on Schlesinger's panel, presidents had to possess a certain kind of vision, apparently. Mostly it consisted of favoring policies that expanded the role of the federal government in domestic affairs, particularly economic affairs, at the expense of the private sector. One sees a less discernible pattern in the Big Nine's approach to foreign policy and middle engagements and military engagements. I will say it helps to win a war. It helps to win a big one. But all of them weren't war presidents, as Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt could attest. And I suspect if Arthur could have brought himself to do it, Mr. Eisenhower as well. But we'll pass that for now. When viewed through this prism, Ronald Reagan, whose sense of an ideal America, symbolized by the often mentioned city on a hill, was one that included less government and lower taxes, reduced regulation, a world bereft of an evil empire, and perhaps an America and a world free of nuclear weapons. His standard sense of the ideal America and a path toward achieving it. Now, that seemed to be like Ronald Reagan in spades. Schlesinger records, and here's where we get into the other difficulty with this kind of a rating. Schlesinger records that Reagan received 7 near-great votes. I assume one was from Forrest McDonald. Some cast by, he says, liberal scholars impressed by his success in restoring the prestige of the presidency, in negotiating the last phases of the Cold War. Couldn't give him credit for winning it. So, in negotiating the last phases of the Cold War, and in imposing his priorities on the country. Reagan received 9 below average votes and 4 failures from others, Schlesinger tells us, who opposed Reagan's tax policies, his view of the government as the cause of the nation's problems, and the increased deficits that occurred under his watch. So a majority of disinterested experts who chose to grade Reagan cast judgment on his politics rather than on his performance or objectives. Coolidge, whose portrait Reagan placed in the cabinet room, could not have said it better. experts. An averaging of Reagan's votes put him in the below average category, one notch up from Chester A. Arthur. Precisely where Schlesinger's 1962 poll had put Dwight Eisenhower. Reminded of the line from the folk song, "When Will They Ever Learn?" Beneath Reagan now, beneath not only the first George Bush, but Martin Van Buren, Benjamin Harrison, and other luminaries. If only for the health of American higher education, one would hope that some of these panelists developed a better standard for measuring the performance of their own students. Does anyone seriously believe that Benjamin Harrison was a better president than Ronald Reagan? Or that Reagan was so dangerous to the country as to merit a grade lower, a grade lower than James Madison, whose fate it was to preside over the burning of the White House and the Capitol at the hands of the enemy? I mean, did anybody do any worse for the Republic? I just don't know. Unlike in the case of the top 9, Schlesinger detected less commonality among the jurors, less commonality in how the jurors rated failures. He rightly asked whether the petty and other corruption that transpired under Grant and Harding and the misguided policies of Buchanan and Johnson and Hoover, to say nothing about the constitutional indiscretions and transgressions of Richard Nixon. Yet they're all put in the same category, too, at the bottom of the list without any distinctions. Now back to Mr. Coolidge. Schlesinger and his panel reserved the guile, to which Coolidge reminded his listeners that experts are sometimes prone, for the advice he offered President Clinton as to how he might raise his grade in his second term. Let's see here. And now was the time, he said, for Clinton to free himself from polls and focus groups and to abandon the middle-of-the-road policies and practices that won him re-election. So bye-bye school uniforms. In other words, Clinton no longer had any need to pretend he was a new Democrat that he had claimed to be. Now was the time to set things right and pour out the old-time Democratic religion, whether the country needed a healthy dose of stimulation or not. And so it goes. Those of you interested in Clinton, I do recommend John Harris's book, Survivor. His theme, I was about to say, Clinton was thinking of taking Arthur's advice, but as the other folk song says, but the clouds got in his way. But those of you interested in talk about the Clinton second term particularly, John Harris's book, Survivor, the argument is that Clinton was at his best when he played defense. He was at his best when he took on Gingrich to do what? To pass the budget and reopen the government. He was at his best when it came to outfoxing the Republicans during the impeachment questions. But the big riddle, as Fred asks in his own book, The Presidential Difference, is why a man with such obvious talents left so little behind. Well, there have been, that's my opinion now, we can argue about this during the questions. Well, there have been many other attempts to improve upon the Schlesinger rating. I won't go through all the polls. I mean, you get the general thrust of it. And I'm trying to be mindful of the time here. So what I'm proposing to do is to look at a couple of things. I don't claim that it's scientific, but I do think it's an interesting little guide that might not be as ephemeral as some of these polls. It might actually give us something to learn. By the way, I talked about Coolidge. I don't want to pass this completely. Coolidge was not the only one who doubted the validity of surveys. Another one was John Kennedy. He starts off his book on Abraham Lincoln by reminding his readers that in the early 60s, during the Civil War centennial, he was asked to give a lecture on Lincoln at the White House. Kennedy asked to take him aside. And of course, the first Schlesinger, the 62 poll, had already come out. And Kennedy says, how could you really tell? You and your colleagues, you sit here blasé, looking at this form, you just fill this thing out, you send it in like you're, applying for sending in a raffle ticket. I mean, how do you really know what these guys were thinking? No one has a right to judge any president, he said, not even poor James Buchanan, who comes always on the bottom as well, deservedly. Unless you have sat in his chair, examined his mail and the information that came across his desk, watch him make decisions. Well, we can't actually do that with all of them. We can't make this a preserve of only presidents, and we never have any evaluations, so they'd all come out perfectly. So one of the things I'm taking a look at are some of the things that they bring to office with them that aren't going to change as issues do. So I'm looking at character, which we'll talk about in a moment, political competence, and vision. These are the lenses through which presidents organize their administration, interact with subordinates and peers and the general public, and shape their respective legacies. Often, although not always, in ways that have given clues to how they might perform in office, sometimes you get a glimpse in how they performed in the previous posts they've held, whether they be governors or generals or business leaders or whatever they may come from. Okay. I say issues change. Woodrow Wilson, Lyndon Johnson, and the current George Bush all began their terms as domestic reformers, yet each is best known today for being president during a time of a major war. Internal components they brought to bear, which determine how presidents adapted to new sets of circumstances, I think are a better guide. Some, such as Abraham Lincoln and Harry Truman, rose to the occasion that they confronted. Others, such as Andrew Johnson and Herbert Hoover, probably shrank. It has been centuries since Heraclitus proclaimed that a man's character was his fate. Such has been the running theme in the mountains of biographies of presidents. One need not delve deeply into the psychological literature to know what the term character conveys, even though presidents have varied widely in character as they have in height, weight, ideology, and other things. Under the heading character fall all the old-fashioned concepts parents have attempted to instill in their young for generations. I think it's still a pretty good guide. What is character? Honesty. Doing what one said one would do, barring unforeseen circumstances rendering such behavior impossible or contrary to the national good. So if you cannot do it, you tell the public why. You explain it. You don't just say, okay, well, I only said that when I was running for president. I really liked Rumsfeld. I was lying to you. I didn't want the, quote, war to become an issue in the campaign. I will give him a bad mark on that one. But on character, again, doing what one said one would do, barring unforeseen circumstances, rendering such behavior either impossible or contrary to the public good. Courage, a word we heard a lot from John Kennedy. Meeting the adversity head on, willing to take calculated risks where the national interest warrants it, willing to forego high approval ratings. Think of Harry Truman in that one again. He could have done a lot to raise his grades. He thought he had the right policies. He was going to continue them, and history would judge him accurately. I think it has. Integrity, placing the interests of one's office or one's country ahead of personal conveniences or interests or those of one's associates. I think of that later when I'll be watching the testimony about the U.S. attorneys. This might be a way through this executive privilege matter. Placing the interests of one's office or one's country ahead of personal convenience or interest or those of one's associates. So when Dwight Eisenhower, for instance, says, I'm going to use executive privilege to shield thousands of files from the McCarthy Committee because I want to preserve the reputation of people in the executive branch. This is, I think, one of the most powerful chapters in Fred's book. He came to our class and talked about that. It's not the same thing as Richard Nixon saying executive privilege because I don't want you to hear my conversations on how we're going to try to sell ambassadorships and pay burglars hush money. I think there's a way we can make some distinctions here and try yet to compare or contrast some of our leaders. Yet character's not enough. Some presidents with the most noble of character, U.S. Grant, Herbert Hoover, come to mind, failed for one of another component that was necessary for them to succeed. And that's what I call competence. But it's competence of a special kind. Both Grant and Hoover had extraordinary competence. One as a general, the other one was an administrator. But in the political realm is where they fell down. This kind of competence consists of the ability to persuade others to follow one's lead and the capacity to manage a large operation called the United States government. So much transpires in the course of an administration where people you don't know, people you didn't appoint, Their slacking off can do you in. Enter Katrina, or things of this kind. No one expects the president to be the head of the Department of Homeland Security, but they expect FEMA to work. And when things don't work, you see what happens. Now, the man for whom the building next door is named, Edward S. Corwin, his most famous line in his book on the presidency was that the Constitution was an invitation to the two branches to struggle. So how do those struggles take place? How does the president deal with Congress? How does he deal with the judicial branch? How does he deal with the bureaucracy, the judiciary? None of these people he can fire at will. In fact, a wise businessman once told me that he described the presidency as, imagine being the chief executive officer of a company with all of your major competitors on your board of directors. Now that's the presidency. And to sit around there and whining about it, as Lyndon Johnson was tend to do, or sitting around trying to circumvent it, as Richard Nixon was forced out of office for trying to do, doesn't kind of cut it. There has to be a way of trying to, you, the voters, can use in factoring some of these candidates out before they do considerable damage. Well, then we have the vision thing. I mean, I think this one is, I think, the easiest. I mean, why do they want to be president? Why do they accept the presidency? What are the things they want to do? Now, sometimes, as has been said about John Kennedy and the civil rights issue, sometimes greatness can be thrust upon one. You have the Freedom Riders going to the South. They create a situation, and how is he going to respond to it? Sometimes a president can rise to the occasion, as Lyndon Johnson did. Same issue on the voting rights bill. We just had the 40th anniversary of the March on the Selma Bridge. Johnson came before he called a special session, a joint session of Congress, the night after the violence. He related a story when he taught school. I guess the one job he had was not an elected job, or one of two jobs he had on the way up. He was teaching in a very poor Mexican school, and these children had absolutely no hope, a terrible family background, dirt poor, subjects of prejudice of all kinds. And Johnson said he thinks of them every day, you know, the power of the ballot. He always said if he had the chance to do something, and I've got the chance and I'm going to use it. Now, that's one of the great examples of presidential courage. If he'd only approached other issues with that kind of a sense of clarity. The opposite was true of the war. No vision, no sense of where he was going, no ability to define it. But on this one, he understood it, and he understood that sometimes Congress could do a few things and make changes, permanent changes. And you know, that's why Johnson gives people a very hard time when they send them these ballots, because it's such a dichotomous presidency. You know, how do you keep the civil rights without the war? Well, the thinking coming from the same man. So one part of the brain, and experientially, his entire life was spent with Congress on domestic issues. That's what he did. My favorite Johnson story was when he figured out that Vietnam wasn't so easy. You know, you just can't throw another 40,000 men, another 40,000 men. And he goes to, I think it was Johns Hopkins, and he proposes the Great Society for North Vietnam. He proposes damming the Mekong Delta. Paul probably remembers this. And he was sitting around saying, you know, what does he want? You know, like you deal with a committee chairman. Well, somebody said, you know, he wants Vietnam. That's what he wants. I mean, you know, hello. He'd never been turned down before. I mean, one of the ways he passed the Civil Rights Bill in 1957, those of you, well, I'm only assigning works by alumni today, and professors here. So I assigned Robert Caro, class of 57, master of the Senate. I mean, he got these senators from New Mexico and Arizona, places where at least the African-American population was very small. He got them to vote for cloture by offering them dams and power and all sorts of things he did in his Texas district. Well, it worked until he met this guy named Ho. He wanted Vietnam. He didn't want the dam, you know. He would have taken the dam if he could get Vietnam. But, I mean, Nixon, the opposite. Okay? We think of Nixon. We think of he wanted to be remembered. This is getting back to character because I'm not going to have time to do my whole Nixon. I want to open it up to you. He wanted to be remembered for foreign policy and not domestic policy. So he comes up with a way of doing domestic policy where, pardon me, let's sort of out-democrating the Democrats. This is sort of Nixon goes to China, but domestically. So this environmental movement is beginning. So he creates the EPA, and he beats them to these various statutes for Clean Water Act was under Nixon. But I could go on. OSHA, affirmative action, Philadelphia plan, wage and price controls. These are not things he believed in. These are things that keep the opposition at bay. So he can hang around with Henry, planning the trip to China, planning this great strategy with Brezhnev. And the irony is that two things live after him, neither of which he intended. We still have all these domestic programs, like them or hate them. And because of the way he tried to preserve the secrecy of the Vietnam strategy and the China opening and everything else, you bring the plumbers in. The plumbers bring you Watergate. Watergate, not only the fall from Nixon, but you think of the plethora of things that I call the Nixon Memorial. All the special prosecutor bills, all the ethics forms we have to fill out, all the conflicts of interest legislation, 30 years of campaign finance. That's Nixon's legacy. Now, if you're running on that program, you'd call yourself John McCain. But the Nixon legacy were things that were not intended. Okay? So I do think that there is a role here for character, and there is a role here for vision. I do give him the vision on the foreign affairs side. Something happened to him when he was very young, at least for a congressman. So he was a young congressman, and he was that big freshman class in 1946. These were the veterans, came home, wanted to start their lives in a hurry. That was a monumental class. It was a big class. It had John Kennedy in it, it had Richard Nixon in it, it had Mayor Wagner in it, and Jacob Javits in it. I mean, these are names of the last generation, many of whom distinguished themselves in many, many ways. And he gets picked to be a small group under Congressman Herter, a future governor of Massachusetts and a future Secretary of State. And the task is, Herter's running the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the task is to look at war-torn Europe, look at the Marshall Plan. He comes back a committed internationalist in a party that had been isolationist before the war, at least in his part of California it had been. And he comes out for the Marshall Plan. He comes out for 8 degrees in Turkey. He develops a fascination when he's vice president with the Far East. And a year or so before he's elected president, he has an article in Foreign Affairs about bringing China into the world. So there was a sense of vision there. And I think we can probe this. And the only people probe it should not be journalists, because they always ask the gotcha questions. But I mean, voters know where to look. And if the right questions are asked, I think we can probe this. So we have character, we have what I call political competence, we have a sense of vision. And then, of course, there are some things no president can avoid. No matter how good or how bad, no president's going to get through 4 or 8 years without dealing with the economy. By his actions, he will make it better or worse, or at least stay out of the way. Enter Nixon and price controls, and we're still sort of dealing with it, the inflation that came when they took them off, and I can keep going. So I'm looking at the economy, whether they made it better, worse, or left it alone. I'm looking at foreign policy and military engagements. And I'll end with my favorite, because I do want some time to hear from all of you. And that's, for lack of a word, maybe you can give me a better phrase, whether they expanded or constricted freedom. Whether they expanded it domestically or across the world, or whether it shrank. I'll give you a couple of examples. Sometimes even a failed president can do some noble things. U.S. Grant. We all talk about Johnson, 1957. We say this is the first civil rights bill in 80 years. Well, who was president 80 years before? U.S. Grant. He sent federal troops to break up the first Ku Klux Klan. He wrote to a friend, this is getting to be a ritual. Every November, there's rioting in the polls, and we're sending down federal marshals. Now, I brought Ted Sorensen to my class last December. Some of you may have been in the audience. He told me when they wrote what became the 64 Civil Rights Bill, they looked at the 1875 Civil Rights Bill, and in many ways it was better. And what happened to U.S. Grant? Well, he lost Congress. And the Democratic Party at that time was not very interested in the rights of African Americans. And he could not have two competing goals. One was let us have peace, let us forget this unpleasantness, which Barbara Sigmund, Paul's late wife, used to say all the time, never said Civil War. She used to say the unpleasantness, because it divided the Democratic Party as well as the country. And at that time, the Democratic Party was the only national party. So you can't have let us have peace and what was very close to Grant's heart, finishing the goals of the war. Jim McPherson, wonderful course, I wish you were still teaching it. It tells us about Grant's idea was basically let the soldiers fight for their freedom. What, 250,000 strong, 200,000 African Americans in the Union Army. This is part of Grant's plan of war by attrition. He was not going to sell them out. Not when he had control of Congress, he wasn't. And he saw what happened to his predecessor. He was not about to get impeached for sending troops down the South when Congress is talking about what? Cutting off the money. So a lot of these arguments that we're having, we think that we've invented them under Ms. Pelosi and under Mr. Bush and Mr. Bertha. I mean, we've been there before, which is why it's worth studying history. It may point a way out. So those are my 3 things they bring with them and 3 things that happen to them. And why don't I stop here and take your questions? I know you all wanted to say a few things. Oh, I come out. Okay, good.
Well, our custom in Madison program is to reserve the first few minutes of question time for student questions. So undergraduates, graduate students, high school students. Some of your former students from the Garwood course.
Yeah, I do.
Now, and some students from constitutional interpretation. Who would like to open us up?
Oh, come on. You weren't shy in class. You're only shy now.
Go ahead and ask the obvious question. Okay, Al, there you go.
Well,
who's number 1? Who's number
I think I think in your mentioning number 1, you answered your question. By every one of these, I know we can have a big argument whether it's Lincoln or Washington, but by every one of these factors I cited, it was George Washington every single time. We know that a lot of these stories are made up, particularly about the cherry tree. But they're made up in order to teach young people the importance of virtue and the importance of character. And, we go to Mount Vernon, and you say to yourself, this is the home of a millionaire. This is the home of a very rich, successful person. He didn't start out that way. Under the rules of primogeniture, which of his time, which was a British custom, meant the oldest child got everything. Got the estate, got the titles, got everything else. And the younger children had to go out and fend for themselves. And he did not expect to be the landholder of Mount Vernon. He wanted a career in the Army because that was another way of getting respectability. And a couple of things have happened through circumstance and through his own work. A circumstance, his older 2 brothers just happened to die, which is how he got Mount Vernon, which is sort of convenient for him in a way. But he decided that no matter how valiantly he could fight and how many British regulars he could save in the French and Indian War, this is where he built up a continental reputation, there was this, we call it glass ceiling. It was only so high that a colonial could go in the British regiment. Suddenly, Big George discovers the meritocracy. There's something wrong here. Now, he'd be the last one to say that he was an intellectual. He was very cognizant of the fact that he didn't go to college, and he made sure to have people around him, like Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson, who did, to correct his drafts and to give him to take care of his correspondence and things of that kind. But he learned about revolution very experientially. He would go down to the House of Burgesses. He would listen to the debates, and he would say, "Yeah, nobody has the right to pick my pocket without my consent. We should vote for these people." And he made himself. They were very cognizant of the 18th century about how people think of you. What is your reputation? And reputation doesn't mean what we say it is necessarily now. A role was something you became. And he spent about 60 years creating the role of Washington. By the time he was president, everybody knew what a Washington was. He made himself. He studied etiquette. He studied the rules of the court and other things. You know the old story, the story when he was asked to, when he thought he was going to be asked to be the leader of the Continental Army, he designed his own uniform and he wore it to Philadelphia. I mean, you know, c'est moi, but he never said a word. It was pretty clear. You know, everybody, that's where the expression "let George do it" come from. And through that person of Washington, he was able to stop a military coup at the end of the war. Congress hadn't paid the Army for some time. The officers thought that they could rebel. And he puts on this uniform. He brings them all into a hall like this. He didn't have a sinus issue to worry about, but he had a need for reading glasses. So he has a statement to read and why they shouldn't do this to the Congress. And he puts the glasses on and he starts wiping the glasses and he starts saying that he's not only grown old in the service to his country, but nearly blind. Well, that was the end of the coup. And the reputation was such. That he made it. The only man I know who made a career out of resigning. Okay, he resigned about 5 times. You know, he resigns as soon as they're okay. A little local stories, and the Congress is sitting at Nassau Hall because the soldiers and everybody else were rioting for their back pay in Philadelphia. So the Congress escapes becoming here. I guess they had a worse transit system in those days now. Okay, so they're sitting here, and word comes that they didn't have emails. You know, word comes that the Treaty of Paris has been signed. So he gets on a horse and gets out of here. First thing he wants to do is surrender his commission. And every time he surrenders a commission, he has another speech to give, some more advice to give. It's sort of like a bar mitzvah speech in reverse, you know. And he's looking back, and he's saying what kind of a country he envisions, what his vision for the country, you know, is going to be. And then he first time in history, George III said that if Washington really is going to go back to the farm and not take power, then he's the greatest man on earth. This is the man we just beat in a war. Then he comes back again. He's drafted back to the Constitutional Convention. And he goes through this big dilemma. Should I take it or not? If I take it, then there's going to be risk. If I don't take it, they're going to think the country that I want the country to fall apart. And I like the Articles. I hate the Articles. So he shows up in person. And Monroe writes to Jefferson, who's still ambassador to Paris, France. He says, you know, one single soul save the government. That was the quote. One soul saved the government. Jump ahead 10 years. Jefferson says, curse that man's virtues. They're ruining the country. You know, in the sense, you know, parties have now formed. He said, if only it weren't for his virtues, I can't attack him. Adams is easy. Don't worry about it. But as long as he's here, I can't do it. I can't form a party. I can't take control. So I would say, you know, and again, what is he? We remember the Washington farewell address. We remember the farewell to the officers. We remember like resigning. So I would say, in terms of all the things I mentioned, you know, Lincoln gave him a good run for his money, no question about it. But I would say each of these categories. I will take Lincoln at his word and say that it wasn't a foreign war. Therefore, I can't use foreign policy, but I can use military. So I hope that's an answer. Anybody else? Students first? Yes, Andrew. Yes.
You mentioned Eisenhower as a president earlier, growing reputation.
Yes. Yes.
Who's another president you fight for?
Well, there's going to be. Of course, all these polls put James K. Polk in the near great, but never tell you why. Right? They never tell you why, because that's the one war we're ashamed of. I mean, right? I mean, Grant said it was the only war we took clearly for property. He says this in his, and he also calls it a racist war in his memoirs. And so the fact that we were so dexterous in planning it and in achieving it, Polk ran on about 4 things, and he got everything done. I mean, he settled the boundary with Canada. He doubled the size of the United States, of course, by theft if you want, but he did. He lowered the tariff, which is a big Jacksonian issue, and there were a couple of other things that he did. There's going to be I can't remember the author. There's going to be a big Polk book out in May, and we'll talk about it. Lincoln first. Well, talk about duplicity here. I don't think Polk makes the character test, but he basically orders the American army 100 miles south of what everybody thought was the border then, and they are fired upon. Well, we're going through this now with Iran and the Brits, right? Well, so where were they and who fired on them? Where were they standing? Abraham Lincoln and the Spots Resolution. This is the great Lincoln speech in Congress. And so that belongs with Gulf of Tonkin and some other things, okay? But I would say Polk you're going to hear a lot more about. And, you know, there's a group, there's a group of people that I hang around with, kind of eccentrics in Vermont. You know, well, everybody in Vermont is eccentric, but the Coolidge birthplace is in Vermont. That's the famous place where he was sworn in when Harding died. We're not arguing that he was a great president. He wasn't. But we're arguing that he was an underestimated president. He was not the fool that have come down to us in the history books as being. There's no doubt about that. And if you talk about healing a country, Harding didn't leave a country off as bad off as Nixon, but pretty close. I mean, the Teapot Dome comes out right after Harding's death. And, you know, so there was nobody for Calvin to pardon since Harding was gone. He died. But he does some of the things Jerry Ford does. He doesn't wait for Congress to ask for the documents. He makes them all public. He puts all the Harding stuff out on the White House lawn, basically. He appoints two prosecutors, a Democrat and a Republican, to monitor each other. He had enough sense to stay out of trouble, as he used to like to say. But in terms of trust and in terms of you know, those kinds of things, I don't think he deserves to be as low as he is. Doesn't mean he's a great president, but certainly an underappreciated one. No.
Does reevaluation ever go the other direction?
God, I hope. Well, I hate to attack Princeton presidents, but I attacked one. Okay. There's no question that Woodrow Wilson was an extraordinary administrator. There's no question about it. And remember, we had not had American troops cross an ocean fighting on another continent in our history. I suppose the Navy did in the Spanish-American War, but the idea of sending an army of 2 million men off to Germany broke the resistance of the Western Front, had enough sense to pick General Pershing and listen to him and all of that, marshaling the war effort at home, and then, you know, the great idealism of the peace conference. But when his biographer was here, John Milton Cooper, Paul Sigmund and I, and some of you asked questions about Woodrow Wilson domestically. Okay, he might have been a product of his times, but he was a racist. He segregated the nation's capital. He segregated the nation's workforce. There were separate water fountains in the Treasury Department for whites and blacks that were not there under Taft and were quietly removed under Eisenhower. It took that long. And no one writes about this. And, you know, it just seems to me that even if you control for his times, you know, I used to say after I took Jim's course that the North won the war and went on making money in business, and the Southerners wrote the histories. And then you introduced me to William Dunning. And William Dunning, the Gone with the Wind view of the South. You see other reputations. You're seeing Grant come up. You're seeing Andrew Johnson come down. Let's talk about Jack Kennedy for a minute. Profiles in Courage. This is one of the last times modern history has presented Andrew Johnson, not exactly in a good light, but Edmund Ross has given great courage for casting the deciding vote that kept Johnson in office. Okay? Well, that was 1955, I think, the Kennedy book came out. Well, by the 60s, people start going back and seeing, well, what were Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner really doing? Well, they were doing what Lyndon Johnson would do in 1964. That's why Johnson stopped them. That's why they wanted to impeach him. And so Johnson's reputation is now falling. I mentioned that because, you know, it goes up. Because now Woodrow Wilson, academically, was I don't think he studied under Dunning, did he? I don't think so. Not at Hopkins, but Dunning was at Columbia, right? Yeah, I paid attention. but seriously, Dunning started this view of the South. Wilson popularized it. He wrote a very popular series on the history of the American people, and you read the section on the war. You know, his earliest memory was watching Robert E. Lee come through the town where he was growing up at the time. Okay, how do you square this then? Then Woodrow Wilson, because he was a great progressive, yes, he supported women's rights, yes, supported 8-hour day, yes, he opposed prohibition, he probably would have opposed the restrictive immigration clauses of the 20s. All that's yes. And that gives him very high marks. Created the Federal Reserve, saw ahead many ways. Well, what about the problem at home? Well, he made it worse, not better. And one's tempted to do the dichotomy of Nixon and Johnson. If you could have China without Watergate, if you could have civil rights without everything else. But with Wilson, they still don't do it. And when Paul pressed Professor Cooper on this, his comment was, well, he had a Southern cabinet, and you had a postmaster general named Burley who gave it all the patronage. Well, okay, so the things we like about Wilson came from Princeton, and the things we don't like came from that awful cabinet. Was he a strong president or not? He appointed these people. Democrats hadn't had a president in 25 years, Robert Cleveland. And they would have been so grateful to Wilson to do whatever he wanted. I mean, he wasn't running on a platform of segregating the government. In fact, the NAACP had supported him because they thought that the Republicans had sort of been where the Democrats are now, which we used to like to say that one party takes you for granted and the other party has no reason to ask for your votes. And that's sort of where the Republicans were. And Wilson actually asked for their votes. And the NAACP supported him first time around. And okay, that's an example.
Floor is open. Yes, sir.
First term versus the one-term presidents versus two-term presidents. Kind of interesting. I think that the ones you usually see on the list are usually two-termers, except for both one-term.
Yes, sir.
Now, my question is, does that have a lot to do with the success of the president being a one-term versus a second term, or is the case out?
Well, I would say the case is out. I would say, though, Washington no exception, because we don't know how Lincoln would have been in the second term. I suspect quite good. But second terms are a funny thing. I can't think of any case where a second term is better than the first. Certainly not true with Washington's. He couldn't wait to get out back to Mount Vernon. Not true with Eisenhower. I mean, less effective than the first term. Well, Bush we pass over, but it's pretty obvious that the second term is not a great success. Clinton, pretty obvious the second term was not as significant as the first term. Even Jefferson goes out with the embargo and New England threatening to secede. So I mean, I can't think of one. It's not an argument for a one-term presidency, but I do think at least our time, and I remember all the two-term presidents we've had since Eisenhower, it seems to me they run out of gas in the sixth year. It seems to me, and it's almost like a certain thing happens and people want another face on television. I don't have an answer for that. Polk was a very effective one-termer by his lights. And I don't know how you count Johnson, because it was his first term in his own right, but he did have that year and a couple of months after Kennedy was assassinated.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
About Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel that his resignation, declining to Congress,
Mm-hmm.
was a depression as a result of his mistakes on Vietnam, or do you feel it was health issues? Because he had so many positive effects
Mhm.
on the set of Vietnam that were
Yeah.
very persuasive of great society.
Well, pardon my French here, but nobody was as quotable as Lyndon Johnson. He himself said that he felt like he had abandoned the woman he really loved, the Great Society, to go chasing that bitch of a war in the other part of the world. It was like I'll keep doing this so I can have my Great Society at home. And he came up with the guns and butter, which was the beginning of the inflation that we all lived through during the Carter-Nixon days. His argument was an odd argument. The argument was, if I don't do this, if I become the first president to lose a war, then the Republicans will say that I lost territory, and they did that to Truman, and I don't want to be the one who lost. I mean, Eisenhower said no to the war. I mean, it wasn't exactly, so you're doing this because you don't want your opponents to hit you for not doing it. He was very depressed. You can read Doris Kearns' book on Lyndon Johnson, The American Dream. He was very depressed. He was having nightmares. He kept thinking she tells a story where he would walk down the White House vestibule and look at the oil portraits of his predecessors. He would always stop at Wilson's because Wilson had the paralysis. And he saw that it was coming to him. when you hear aides talk about him laughing, crying, cajoling, and screaming in the same, all within the same 5-minute interval, you begin to wonder. Lady Bird actually did ask. I'm writing a review on a book about Johnson now, and Lady Bird actually did ask 2 psychiatrists to come in to talk to him. Like he thinks you're applying for ambassadorial spots, so he doesn't know, right? And so they would come in and they would say, he's not kind of out of it, but yeah, very bad. We know he started smoking again, which he had quit during the heart attack. We suspect he was drinking again, and it was a terrible thing. I guess the worst part about it was he didn't believe in it. He did not believe in this. He did not think about it. He had no plan for what to do, what to find victory there. But he couldn't get out. And, if you believe in a war, I think it sustains you more. At least you don't have to worry about the, deception. And he knew about the Tonkin resolution. That was bothering him too. And, but there is this thing about, sometimes it's not just raw intelligence, but it's cognition. I mean, when George McGovern, someone I don't always quote, McGovern was elected in 1964 to the Senate, and he goes in to see Johnson. And he goes, I don't know about this. When I was campaigning, we had this Gulf of Tonkin. I was not here to vote for it. It doesn't make any sense to me. So Johnson starts, he says, the Chinese and the Vietnamese have been at it for 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. I'm not so sure that it would be a Chinese puppet. Maybe a unified Vietnam would be a bolter against the Chinese. I don't know. So Johnson starts yelling at him. I didn't send for a goddamn historian. You and Bill Fulbright, all you do is talk history. I got 500,000 men over there, Well, why are they there then, Lyndon? He never asked those questions. It was just another 40,000, another 40,000, another 40,000. I remember that presidency extremely well, since I had we were all subject to the draft, and I had a high draft number, but I remember listening to our transistor radios at the well of a college library as they were actually announcing the lottery numbers. That was under Nixon, but everybody thought that we were going to go, so he would go down in history with both of these ways, a positive and a negative. Yes, sir.
Looking it up myself. Calvin Coolidge making a lyric outburst to explain why he decided not to run?
Oh, that's easy. He never said so, but I don't mean easy to, he had a heart condition. He didn't last long as an ex-president. They tended to be less open about things than we are now. And also, a lot of people have discovered the importance of their home life to a presidency. He was one of 3 or 4 presidents to lose a child during his time. And in 1924, during the Democratic Convention, the one that went on for 108 ballots, he had a son that went out and played tennis and developed a blister, and they didn't have penicillin then. He was gone within a week or two. And Coolidge said the joys of the office went out then. If he hadn't been renominated, he would have not run then. Mrs. Coolidge came out of it, but there weren't. If you look at Coolidge as a governor, he's a very aggressive governor in Massachusetts. He was progressive. Interesting. You could change with the times. They're talking about Romney, but he adapted. This was a progressive governor. This was a governor pushing all the things that Wilson was pushing as president: anti-child labor, greater inspections, greater regulations, double teacher salaries twice when he was governor. A great hero to the immigrants, great hero to the Catholic community. He was running for mayor of Northampton, and he wrote in his autobiography, "Bless their Irish hearts, I won by 3 votes. I know exactly those 3 people, and I'm going to thank them tomorrow." But when the child died, there was a real change in his disposition, and we'll never know. But it's not true in every case, but certainly true in his case.
Now, can I ask you a question about evaluative standards and the question of objectivity and neutrality and trying to come up with a way of being fair in the evaluation system?
Yeah.
The principles of character and political competence and vision, as you describe them, look to me like they're aspiring to a kind of neutrality as far as one's concrete political judgments are concerned. You can have an honest person in the office who may be very liberal or very conservative. You can have a competent person who's very liberal or very conservative. You can be a liberal vision like Roosevelt's vision, or a conservative vision like Reagan's vision. But then at the very end, you added another one, if I understood you correctly, which is whether freedom expanded or contracted. Now, here it looks to me like we may have a problem.
You mean the current president?
No, I mean,
Oh.
I mean with the category, with the use of the category.
Yeah.
I mean, if we really want the historians, political scientists who are evaluating presidents to do it on a kind of nonpartisan, objective basis, and it looks to me like if that's going to be a legitimate ground on which to evaluate, you run into an inescapable problem from if the person who is evaluating whether freedom is expanded or contracted has a left liberal understanding of freedom, then it will evaluate the president differently than if he's got a libertarian conservative view, and yet again differently if he has the correct view, the social conservative view, or the view that sees the social conservative view as the opposite of freedom. So it looks at that point as though it's almost an invitation to do what I thought you were complaining about them doing, an invitation to import their own moral political judgments into the evaluation. Weren't we arguing for a situation, for a set of standards that would enable a fair-minded liberal historian, political scientist, a fair-minded liberal to judge the same as a fair-minded conservative?
There's no question about it. The easy answer is that objectivity conforms with the author's view. In this case. But no, I mean, the Wall Street Journal, I didn't want to go through all the polls. The Wall Street Journal, the American Federalist Society, I mean, two groups you would all think of as conservative, did their own poll. And lo and behold, Franklin Roosevelt comes in among the near greats, as he comes in among the greats, and Schlesinger is sort of a notch down, but he's not failure. They disagreed with him. It is possible. They said, did he expand freedom? Well, getting rid of Hitler was a big one, even for libertarians. We're not so sure about how he handled the Russians, but didn't live long enough. So, on balance, they probably still don't like the New Deal, but he came up very high in their poll. Johnson did not become a failure. Interesting. They bought what I bought. That if there's one thing that will get Lyndon Johnson into heaven, it's probably that bill, the '64 Civil Rights Bill. Had he not run for re-election, he'd probably be rated very high. No war, none of those other problems. But so I don't know. Take Wilson again. Even by an objective standard. Was it a good thing to allow women to vote? I think so. Was it a good thing to try to constrain child labor? I think so. Was it an 8-hour day a good thing, even though, as a conservative, we don't want to regulate I think so. But then you have to deal with, in his time, here's the problem. In his time, they didn't think about civil rights. I mean, these people didn't count. Even among liberals in his time, you didn't see Walter Lippmann in the New Republic asking him to do it. So even among liberals, this was not an issue that people talked about. In our time, I think, you have to look at him and say there's a real problem here. Go ahead.
More questions.
What about Reagan?
Yeah.
No.
I mean, Reagan, if you look at economic freedom, he expanded it, but
Yeah.
you could argue that political freedom,
Well, on the domestic side of political freedom there, he was a libertarian. I don't see how Reagan wasn't censoring books and raiding libraries. Getting rid of the Soviet Union is probably a good thing. I mean, I think the Poles thought it was a great thing. The Czechs thought it was a great thing. The Hungarians thought it was great. He probably liberated more people than anybody since Franklin Roosevelt. How many people were living under captivity? Some cases 80 years, some cases 40 or 50 years.
But that libertarianism of Reagan's, which on a conservative, a certain kind of conservative view would count as an expansion of freedom, on a certain sort of left liberal view is an attack on freedom. It's reducing freedom.
Reagan maintained, we can argue about this, but Reagan maintained that he was not trying to undo the New Deal, and he was not trying to undo the safety net. He was trying to roll back some of the excesses of the Great Society, which we haven't yet discussed. There are issues with Johnson on the domestic side that historians are beginning to look at and beginning to wonder about. But in terms of desegregation, you have to give Johnson that. It changed the South. Reagan, I'm not aware that he took freedom away, but if you want to give me an example, Matt or Robbie, go ahead.
Look at it from a left liberal point.
would Reagan have expanded their freedom?
I don't know. He said as president that the one thing he regretted, of course he was president, and you have to say they're all politicians. When he was president, he said the one thing he regretted was that he opposed the '64 Civil Rights Bill at the time, and he was a Goldwaterite. And he said he regretted that. He changed his mind. William Buckley said the same thing. National Review said the same thing. They opined against it at the time. Paul Sigmund, if he's still here, debated Bill Buckley on that subject in the late 50s.
What about the incarceration of that?
Oh, I think he would argue that he was tough on crime, as I hope we would all be. I don't think he sat there and said, let's lock up more African Americans, even if the numbers are what you say. This is tough. This is tough. No question about it.
There are more than two, but there are
No question about it.
different views about whether you're expanding or contracting freedom with these policies. They're honorable
I would agree.
positions.
I would agree.
And you want the historian's vote to reflect the historian's particular point of view on that. Now, on your first three criteria, liberals and conservatives can judge the same. But on this one, it looks like.
Well,
I think you keep.
I hear you. I hear you.
Yeah.
No, I hear you, and it's difficult. I don't think it's impossible. I think just one thing. There were two presidents that I could definitely say, and you would probably agree with me, reduced freedom to some extent. And I mentioned, when Wilson brings segregation into the nation's capital, into the government. Okay, that's taking away something that existed before. When Andrew Jackson says, "I don't give a hoo-ha," he probably didn't say that. What the Supreme Court says, the Seminoles are leaving, right? Let me set the table for you. Now, all look at your $20 bills and join my campaign to replace Jackson with Reagan or Coolidge. Okay. The Supreme Court, the state of Georgia wants the western lands for settlers, okay? And they passed a law saying the Indians have to go. Well, the Indians tried to contest this, and they weren't citizens of this country. They couldn't contest it. So they found a clergyman who was a citizen, who was teaching them English and working with them to contest it. I forgot the name of the case, but there are a lot of lawyers in here. Thank you, Worcester. Thank you. And John Marshall, another candidate for the $20 bill, by the way. John Marshall says that, they have a treaty with the United States, signed by my cousin, Mr. Jefferson. You can't have a state government abrogate a federal treaty that they're protected. And the state of Georgia has no standing. So what does Jackson do? He sends the federal marshals of the United States Cavalry to carry out the Georgia law, the Trail of Tears, to force these people to be relocated to the Oklahoma Territory. That's a man greatly reduced freedom, as far as I see it. And I think the same thing about the one example I could find of Wilson. I haven't found too many villains in the White House who and then we talk about expanding the franchise. I haven't seen too many wanting to constrict the franchise. So, I mean...
I wanted to give you another freedom restrictor.
Yeah, it's good. That's good. Yeah, go ahead.
President 2 and 3. President number 3, in fact...
Jefferson?
Yeah, did two things to restrict freedom. Well, several things. Let's start with the fact that Jackson takes a lot of heat for a process for Jefferson. Sort of now acknowledged he was started. And we know from the constitutional plan he sent to Madison on the Louisiana Purchase that he intended to use everything north of Missouri as an Indian reservation to remove all Indians from one side of the Mississippi, whether they chose to or not. That purchase also increased or challenged the problem of freedom because his original plan was that everything north of Missouri would be an Indian reservation and everything south would be slave states. The third way he reduced freedom was, of course, in reversing the course of the Federalist administration, isolating Haiti and offering to help Napoleon bring slavery back to Haiti.
Right.
The final one
Right.
is during the embargo crisis, with the exception of Lincoln, I don't know anyone that imposed martial law more thoroughly or completely than Thomas Jefferson. By contrast, his predecessor usually gets away with things pretty much.
Well, and having attacked his successor, I will point out that fewer people were incarcerated while the war was going on, the War of 1812, than were incarcerated during the embargo, right? There was no martial law. In fact, there's a new book on perfect unions about Dolly Madison, about a woman was protesting the war, wanted to secede. She went down to Washington. She had let her braids grow down to her ankles, and she shows up at the White House gate. What's that? I want to cut my braids and hang Mr. Madison. Right? You know, she got as far as the parlor. I mean, you know, so nobody was molested. The White House was burned. And he wrote the Constitution, he wrote the Bill of Rights, and he wasn't going to violate it. Now, you can argue maybe he had a silly policy. Maybe Lincoln's policy was much better. Maybe the effect was probably greater. But in a wartime, Madison was much more tolerant of civil liberties. There were no incarcerations like there were in World War II under Mr. Roosevelt, which is something I'd be weighing a little bit about and restricting freedom. You know, it's hard. I grant it. I mean, nothing's easy. Nothing worth the effort's easy, and it's worth thinking it through. Won't please everybody. I understand what you're saying, because you know, Lincoln's point about the freedom of the slaveholders. You know, you know the quote better than I do, but something to the effect about it's amazing that there are some who demand the freedom to oppress others, but so be it. It's protected in the Constitution. And I won't disturb it. It's words to that effect. I think I have it right, at least the idea right. Ricky? Hey, good to be back. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, no one took him at his word when he said he didn't believe in freeze. He believed in getting rid of these things. Nobody took him at his word. I remember the freeze movement, and it was probably very popular in this campus. We had a referendum in New Jersey. Christine probably certified it. It was a very big thing in the blue states, what we call the blue states. I suspect that given the problems he had with, you know, how they characterized Star Wars, they probably thought he was just a foolish dreamer. How could he be a hawk, as so many other things, and believe in a world free of nuclear weapons? I know that Doug Brinkley is bringing out in May the Reagan Diaries, and we'll be able to see if he talked about his strategy at all in that. I don't know. But he wrote himself a note every night. We know that. And some of them are worth reading. I looked at some of them. I haven't read the whole thing, but it's going to be edited, and we might have an idea now.
Mr. Allen?
Yes, Bill. Hi. Hi.
I want to tell you that I have formally taken the position of never answering any of those surveys. People organize them to project their particular perspective, and I don't see any escape from that. Nevertheless, I think it's good to have the totality evaluation, and I want to change the topic slightly. I know it's focused
Yeah,
now.
yeah. We have a little.
I wonder if you would add to your reflection a question when it comes to evaluating the greatness or lack thereof of our president, whether it ought to have any relationship to the greatness or lack thereof of the people that we
Mm. That's a brilliant observation to close on. That is really amazing. In other words, do we get the presidents we deserve? Okay. Back to our friend Mr. Wilson again. Let's talk about the failed treaty. Did it fail because of character, in which case would be stubbornness? All right. Did it fail because it was he was not competent, because he couldn't handle Congress, couldn't make the case, couldn't change his tactics? Or let's deal with this: did the American people really, in 1920, want to give the right to send American forces into harm's way, give that to an international body, which was what Article 10 was. And the argument Lodge made, actually read the reservations, was that Britain at that time, we may not like colonialism, but at that time they had 6 votes. We had the 2 million men. They had lost 3 million men in World War II, World War I. Germans, I think, 5 million. We had the army, we had the doughboys, and they had Australia, Canada, South Africa, Britain. Well, this came up with Mr. Truman. You've got Stalin's got 1 vote, Bulgaria's got 1 vote, and so they set up the Security Council. There was no Security Council with Wilson's League. So were the American people really saying, yeah, we voted for you in 1916, and you promised not to go to war. All right, that's why we voted for you, right? He kept us out of war. Well, okay, so we had the war. Okay, you couldn't control that the Germans were going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. So we took care of the Germans. Kaiser's gone. We're not so sure that we want to have. We voted for a Republican Congress, and we're not so sure we want to have American boys sent by these 6 British votes without an act of Congress. Of course, unlike modern presidents, at least he asked Congress for declaration of war. Okay, but so maybe it was your question. Maybe it was the people here, and maybe democracy does rule. Your other question is, do we get the president that we deserve? Right? If the mores of the country are at a certain point, well, does the president reflect that, or does he try to change that? And Mr. Roosevelt tried to change that. His greatest years, I think, were from 38 to 41, where he saw what was coming, and he could push the country only so far. One could argue even broke a few laws to do that. But he saw it coming. He was trying to change it. Or did they reflect it? And I think I'll yield back to you.
So that's all very well. Just one last part of it, namely, couldn't the great perspective have the president's ability to do something better?
Right. I agree with that. Yes, I agree with that.
Well, wasn't this marvelous? Thank you.